Good evening, my friends. Just a little housekeeping before we begin tonight's monologue and educational rant. We are currently waiting on YouTube to investigate why our channel AI Antinatalism was removed. We will be keeping Rumble and TikTok as backups and repositories of older lessons, rants, comedy, monologues, responses, and takedowns. We do have a plan for another channel if this appeal does not succeed. It will be announced at a later date. Thank you all for your ongoing support and patience. Now, on with the show. There is a particular kind of modern idiot who mistakes being horny in public for a philosophy. Not an ordinary person who enjoys sex. That would be too normal, too harmless, too uninteresting. I mean the loud, terminally online sex-positive evangelist who has turned appetite into identity and identity into a moral ranking system. The sort of person who hears the word boundary and reacts like a vampire shown a crucifix. The kind of clown who thinks sexual bravado is evidence of psychological development. The kind who believes the highest form of human maturity is to be permanently unbothered, maximally available, and never once caught taking dignity seriously. That is the species under examination. Now, to keep the village idiots from stampeding into the replies with torches made of bad reading comprehension, let me be precise. The issue is not that these people like sex. Humanity likes sex. It has been one of the species' more repetitive hobbies. Liking sex is not a moral accomplishment. It is not a sign of enlightenment. It is not proof that one has escaped old taboos through sheer courage and sophistication. It is a biological appetite. The problem begins when that appetite gets dressed up in moral language and sold back to the world as wisdom. That is where the rot sets in. The sex-positive clown does not merely say, adults should be free to make consensual choices. That would be boring, sensible, and insufficiently theatrical. No, they need to build an entire worldview around posture. In their universe, there is one main moral axis. The more sexually uninhibited you appear, the more evolved you are. The more detached you are from exclusivity, jealousy, embarrassment, loyalty, or heartbreak, the more enlightened you must be. The less you visibly care, the more psychologically advanced you are presumed to be. A person who wants fidelity becomes insecure. A person who dislikes cheating becomes controlling. A person who thinks some sexual conduct is degrading becomes repressed. Every emotional limit is translated into pathology. Every standard becomes fear. Every hesitation becomes ignorance. This is what passes for ethical sophistication in certain corners of the internet. It is not sophistication. It is toddler morality in expensive sunglasses. The first and most obvious defect in this worldview is that it confuses freedom with indulgence. Real freedom is not the same thing as doing whatever one wants in the moment. A free adult is not merely a creature with options. A free adult is a creature capable of governing itself. Freedom involves judgment, restraint, proportion, foresight, and the ability to act according to values rather than just appetite. Indulgence, by contrast, is much simpler. Indulgence is wanting something, doing it, and then inventing a theory afterward so one does not have to feel embarrassed. The sex-positive clown is almost never defending freedom in the serious sense. Freedom requires discipline, and discipline is unfashionable. Freedom requires responsibility, and responsibility is terrible for branding. What they are defending is appetite with a publicist. They want to do what they want, when they want, with as little moral friction as possible, while still imagining themselves brave, healed, and intellectually ahead of everyone else. This is one of humanity's oldest scams. Take a desire, wrap it in philosophy, and call yourself courageous for obeying it. The second defect is even uglier. This worldview flattens sexual ethics into a single stupid question. How inhibited did everyone seem? That is not enough, not remotely enough. Human intimacy is shaped by trust, history, expectation, asymmetry, fear, ego, loneliness, dependency, and the extraordinary human talent for lying to both others and oneself. A sexual arrangement is not ethically legible just because people can describe it as consensual or open-minded. People can agree to things for rotten reasons. They can consent under pressure, out of fear of abandonment, out of inferiority, out of desperation to keep someone interested, out of a learned habit of making themselves smaller so someone else will stay. And yet the clown hears the sacred word consent and assumes the moral work is finished. Case closed. Everyone go home. Apparently, 2 syllables has conquered the full complexity of power, motive, coercion, vulnerability, and emotional asymmetry. Remarkable. Civilization need never think again. But of course, that is nonsense. Consent matters enormously. It is indispensable. It is also the floor, not the ceiling. It tells you that force may be absent. It does not tell you whether honesty is present, whether the arrangement is humane, whether one person is being spiritually flattened to preserve access to the other, or whether the whole thing is structurally tilted toward the more dominant party. The sex-positive clown hates this level of analysis because it ruins the clean simplicity of permissiveness. It forces them to admit that technically consensual situations can still be manipulative, imbalanced, exploitative, or corrosive. That admission would spoil the vibe, and the vibe, as we know, is the true sovereign of modern moral thought. Nowhere is this moral shallowness more obvious than in how these people treat betrayal. The clown's instinct, when confronted with cheating, is often to reduce it to a joke about insecurity. Why does it matter? Why are you upset? It was just sex. Maybe you should loosen up. Maybe you should join in. Maybe you should become friends with the person who helped turn your relationship into a farce. This response is not merely cruel, it is stupid. Cheating is not mainly about the sex. If it were, people would respond to all sexual acts outside the relationship with identical pain, and they plainly do not. What wounds is not simply the body, it is the deception. Cheating is a fracture in shared reality. One person is living inside the stated terms of the relationship, while the other is quietly operating under different terms entirely. That is what makes it humiliating. That is what makes it disorienting. The injured person does not just discover that their partner had sex with someone else. They discover that their own understanding of the relationship was counterfeit. Memory becomes unstable. Every reassurance becomes suspect. Every tender moment has to be re-examined like evidence in a criminal case. Was it already happening then? Did they lie to my face that night? Did they touch me after touching someone else? Was I the only person still obeying the rules I thought we both lived under? That is the wound. Not just sex, but the theft of informed participation. The clown cannot grasp this because the clown has trained themselves to interpret any strong emotional response around sex as backwardness. Hurt becomes insecurity. Humiliation becomes possessiveness. Moral injury becomes prudishness. In their mind, the only mature response is some form of detached smirk. This is not maturity, it is emotional illiteracy pretending to be modern. Which brings us to one of the clown's favorite maneuvers, pathologizing normal pain. Betrayal hurts, then you need therapy. You do not want your partner sneaking around, then you are controlling. You think loyalty matters? Then you must be fragile. This is manipulative garbage. Not every painful response is evidence of dysfunction. Sometimes the pain is doing exactly what pain is for. It is telling you that something valuable was damaged. It is telling you that trust was violated, that the frame was broken, that the terms under which you gave your heart were not actually the terms being honored. Modern internet culture has made this much worse because it loves turning moral claims into clinical ones. Instead of answering the accusation, people re-describe the accuser. Suddenly you are not wronged, you are dysregulated. You are not disrespected, you are triggered. You are not responding to deceit, you are struggling with scarcity mindset. It is a fantastic little trick. One no longer has to defend one's conduct. One merely has to imply that the person hurt by it has an emotional processing problem. The sex-positive clown thrives on this. It gives them a way to dodge moral scrutiny while sounding therapeutic. Very efficient, very slimy. Then there is desirability, the clown's other religion. Whenever these people feel intellectually cornered, they reach for sexual status like a raccoon reaching for shiny garbage. Suddenly, the discussion is not about honesty, dignity, betrayal, or the ethics of conduct. It is about how many people they have slept with, how wanted they are, how adventurous they were at 19, how they could have your partner if they wished, how much fun everyone else is apparently having without you. They think I get laid is a rebuttal. It is not. Being desired is not a moral credential. It proves almost nothing except that one can generate attraction under some set of conditions. Many fools are desirable. Many liars are desirable. Many narcissists are desirable. Many predators are desirable. Some people are skilled at seduction and dreadful at love. Some people can command erotic attention the way a carnival can command attention, brightly, noisily, and with very little nutritional value. The clown lives inside a status economy where sexual attention functions like a kind of authority, so they begin to confuse being wanted with being wise. This is like mistaking a fast food chain for a culinary philosopher because the drive-thru has a line. It gets worse because a lot of this is performance. The loud online sex-positive persona is usually less a truthful expression of peace than a carefully maintained image. The goal is to appear untouchable, impossible to embarrass, immune to heartbreak, perfectly comfortable with every variation, and perpetually above ordinary emotional concerns. They do not merely defend sexual openness, they perform invulnerability. They signal that nothing can shock them, nothing can diminish them, and nothing can make them look provincial. But truly grounded people do not usually need to narrate their own freedom every 10 minutes. They do not need to advertise how beyond shame they are. They do not need to convert every moral disagreement into a chance to display how little they care. When a person is constantly declaring themselves unbothered, one begins to suspect they are not serene at all. They are armored. They are cultivating an identity built around appearing too evolved to be hurt. That armor matters because people who are obsessed with seeming invulnerable often become contemptuous toward vulnerability in others. They cannot merely disagree with someone who values exclusivity. They must mock them. They cannot simply say that some people prefer looser structures. They must imply that anyone who does not share those preferences is timid, primitive, insecure, or sexually irrelevant. That is because the whole identity depends on contrast. Their liberation is not enough on its own. It must be staged against someone else's alleged repression. The sex-positive clown is, in this sense, not really interested in tolerance. They are interested in rank. This becomes painfully clear when one looks at how the culture treats power. Real sexual ethics cannot ignore power. Not social power, not emotional power, not beauty-based power, not status power, not the power that comes from being less attached than the other person. Two people can outwardly agree to the same arrangement while inhabiting entirely different realities. One may be genuinely enthusiastic. The other may be tolerating misery because they fear losing the person they love. One may feel expansive and free. The other may feel as though they are swallowing glass while smiling in order not to seem backward. The same sentence, "we're open," can describe liberation in one case and slow emotional eviction in another. The clown does not like this fact because it ruins the fantasy that all openness is automatically brave and all restraint automatically fear. Once power enters the picture, one has to ask hard questions. Who wanted this arrangement more? Who benefits more? Who is setting the emotional terms? Who is doing most of the adjusting? Who is suppressing their pain to avoid being left? Who gets to define what counts as maturity? Suddenly, the clean moral picture dissolves, and one sees what was often there all along, not shared freedom, but asymmetry wearing progressive makeup. And this is where the rhetoric becomes actively useful to exploiters. A manipulative person can weaponize the language of liberation with terrifying ease. They can tell someone that their discomfort is social conditioning. They can say their reluctance is repression, their boundaries are fear, their pain is proof they need healing. They can pressure without seeming coercive because the pressure arrives dressed as enlightenment. It does not say, "Submit to my appetite." It says, "Grow." It says, "Work on yourself." It says, "Do not be small." That is one of the most insidious features of the whole worldview. It allows people to recruit others into cooperating with their own override. Resistance becomes shameful. Alarm becomes immaturity. Self-protection becomes evidence of not being evolved enough. Same slime, better vocabulary. Now let us speak of shame because this culture handles the word like a raccoon handles silverware. The clown has been taught that shame is always oppressive, always toxic, always the residue of dead religion or old patriarchy. This is childish. Shame can certainly be weaponized. It can be cruel. It can be excessive. It can be used to crush harmless difference. But it does not follow that all shame is bad. Shame is also one of the ways human beings register that they have behaved beneath their own standards or exposed something in themselves that should not be defended. A culture in which nobody feels shame about deceit, vanity, humiliation, exploitation, or reckless selfishness is not liberated. It is damaged. Shame, when functioning properly, is not the enemy of freedom. It is one of the instruments by which conscience announces that something has gone wrong. Some conduct should trouble you, some lies should burn, some forms of sexual behavior are not merely adventurous but shabby. Some arrangements reveal not courage but vanity, not freedom but callousness, not openness but hunger wearing a thesis statement. The sex clown cannot tolerate this because their world has only two categories: repression and celebration. Either one condemns all non-traditional sexuality, or one affirms everything that can be made to sound consensual. There is no middle ground in which adult freedom coexists with moral discrimination. No room in which one can say, yes, people are free, and also some choices are selfish, degrading, exploitative, or beneath a person's dignity. That sentence is too nuanced for the vibe cult. Commitment suffers terribly under this regime. Not because commitment is impossible, but because commitment exposes the poverty of the clown's imagination. Real commitment means choosing limits for the sake of meaning. It means deciding that one relationship, one promise, one structure of trust is worth more than the endless maximization of erotic novelty. That is not weakness. It is one of the deepest forms of adult agency. To commit is to close doors. To say no to alternatives is precisely what gives the chosen bond gravity, meaning everywhere depends on selective renunciation. You choose one path and thereby refuse others. That is how significance forms. The sex clown, however, often treats commitment as insecurity management. Fidelity becomes fear of competition. Devotion becomes possessiveness. Exclusivity becomes low self-esteem in a trench coat. Why? Because commitment imposes constraints. And constraints are intolerable to people whose identity depends on endless self-expansion. If your highest value is feeling open to possibility, then a closed door feels like diminishment. So, rather than admitting that they dislike the discipline of enduring bonds, they moralize against the bond itself. This is an old trick. People insult virtues they cannot sustain. The public tone around all of this is revealing too. Notice how often the discourse collapses into irony. Someone says cheating would devastate them, and the reply is a joke. Someone says they would feel humiliated by deception, and the response is a meme. Someone says loyalty matters, and a stranger appears to sneer about body count, prudishness, or skill issues. This is not wit, it is cowardice. It is what happens when a culture becomes so allergic to seriousness that it cannot discuss intimacy without hiding behind smirks. Humor can illuminate pain. It can tell the truth sideways. It can puncture vanity. But the clown does not use humor that way. They use humor as an anesthetic and a shield. The joke is there to prevent moral gravity from settling on the scene. If everything remains ironic, then nothing demands courage. If everything is a bit, then nobody has to reveal what they actually believe about loyalty, reverence, dignity, or hurt. Irony becomes not sophistication, but a method of emotional evasion. And so, the culture fills with people who are publicly chill and privately shattered, people who laugh at betrayals they would not survive well, people who call pain insecurity because admitting its legitimacy would force them to revise their worldview. That revision never comes, of course, because the worldview is too useful. It protects appetite from examination. It protects vanity from embarrassment. It protects the dominant from accountability. It gives the self-indulgent a way to sound humane while doing precisely what they want. It is not an accident that the loudest ambassadors of this ethos often seem to have one overriding moral principle. Their desires should be treated as presumptively noble until disproven beyond a reasonable doubt. This is narcissism, though modern people dislike the word because they have learned to reserve it for the most flamboyant monsters. Narcissism does not always arrive in a fur coat with a spotlight. It can arrive chilled out, progressive, fluent in therapy language, and deeply committed to the idea that one's own appetites deserve endless interpretive charity. That is enough. The core of narcissism is not drama, but centrality. One's own wants, comfort, and self-image occupy the middle of the moral picture, and everyone else is expected to adapt around them. The sex-positive clown subculture rewards this. It glamorizes being hard to shame, easy to excite, impossible to pin down, and constantly validated by new attention. It quietly ranks emotional detachment above steadiness, novelty above depth, and availability above devotion. People who cannot or will not live that way are not simply different. They are often framed as less evolved. So the supposed rebellion against old sexual norms becomes a new conformity. The old commandment was, be pure. The new commandment is, be unbothered. The old vanity said, never be stained. The new vanity says, never admit that anything wounds your dignity. Same monkey, different outfit. This new conformity produces a particularly ugly effect. It turns attachment into a source of shame. To care deeply starts to look weak. To want exclusivity starts to look provincial. To feel jealousy starts to look embarrassing. To hurt starts to look like failure. That is catastrophic because attachment is not some weird defect in need of ideological correction. It is one of the core features of being human. People bond, they invest, they become emotionally organized around particular others. They do not become mature by pretending otherwise. They become split, publicly detached, privately desperate, publicly flexible, privately destabilized, publicly enlightened, privately raw. This split creates the exhausted atmosphere one senses around so much of the discourse. People are performing freedom while quietly bleeding from disposability. They call it abundance. They call it openness. They call it anti-scarcity. But abundance can become devaluation very quickly. If everyone is replaceable, then intimacy begins to feel modular, interchangeable, less a bond than a series of opportunities. And once people become interchangeable, loyalty begins to look irrational, devotion begins to look inefficient, and the moral gravity of particular persons starts evaporating. That is one of the bleakest outcomes of the whole thing. Not liberation, but cheapening. Now, to be clear, I am not claiming that monogamy is automatically noble or that all sexual traditionalism is admirable. Humans can ruin monogamy with almost industrial efficiency. A person can be exclusive and still be controlling, dull, cruel, cowardly, or spiritually dead. The point is not that one structure is holy by default. The point is that the clown's framework is grotesquely unfit for evaluating any structure well because it replaces ethics with posture. It asks not, what form of conduct builds trust, dignity, honesty, and care? It asks, how constrained does this look, and can I mock it from a distance? That is not an ethic. It is a costume department. One sees the same defect in language. Notice how rarely the clown speaks in terms of duty, honor, reverence, stewardship, or restraint. Those words have become embarrassing because they imply hierarchy, character, and obligation rather than self-expression. The clown prefers the language of vibes, healing, openness, and authenticity because those terms flatter the chooser. They center the experience of wanting rather than the responsibility of handling another person well. Once moral vocabulary is purged of solemn words, almost anything can be normalized with sufficient aesthetic packaging. This is why the whole phenomenon feels less revolutionary than commercial. It has the flavor of advertising. Expand your possibilities. Follow your desires. Refuse judgment. Stay open. Explore more. It is the language of the market translated into intimate life. Endless option expansion. Endless novelty. Endless sensitivity to one's own wants, and endless suspicion toward anything that limits them. The clown imagines they are rebelling against old norms, but often they are simply acting as excellent consumers in a culture that thrives when commitment is weak, permanence is frightening, and the self is forever shopping for its next validation hit. That is why so much of the supposed liberation feels spiritually thin. Real intimacy is not just sensation. It is repetition, maintenance, patience, memory, forgiveness, dullness, compromise, and the very unglamorous work of continuity. It asks you to be seen over time. It asks you to stay when novelty fades. It asks you to become accountable to a shared reality that does not rearrange itself every time desire twitches. The clown prefers spectacle. They like the theater of connection more than the architecture of it. And architecture is exactly what is missing from the worldview. There is no serious account of what sexuality is for beyond permission, stimulation, and self-expression. There is no durable moral structure capable of handling betrayal, asymmetry, longing, or the meaning of particular promises. There are slogans, there are poses, there are therapeutic euphemisms. There is the endless assurance that judgment is bad and openness is brave. But there is very little in the way of a serious answer to the oldest question of ethics. What sort of person does this pattern of conduct make you? Does it make you more truthful, more tender, more trustworthy, more capable of reverence, more disciplined, more humane in how you carry another person's vulnerability? Or does it make you more vain, more restless, more entitled, more practiced in self-justification, more willing to downgrade another person's pain into a problem of optics? The clown does not ask. They are too busy curating the image of being impossible to embarrass. This is why the culture is so cruel online. It rewards mockery of pain. Someone gets cheated on and people laugh. Someone says they would be hurt by dishonesty and strangers call them prudes or losers. Someone defends exclusivity and is treated like a relic from an inferior civilization. The whole environment encourages people to score status by showing how little they respect attachment. Vulnerability becomes content. Humiliation becomes a joke format. And all of it is justified by the same dead idea. If you were more evolved, this would not bother you. No. If you were more dissociated, perhaps it would not bother you. If you were more narcissistic, perhaps it would not bother you. If you were less capable of devotion, perhaps it would not bother you. But moral maturity does not consist in becoming immune to the violations of trust. That is not growth. That is damage rebranded as sophistication. A genuinely wise sexual ethic would look very different. It would recognize that desire is morally ambiguous, not self-authenticating. It would treat consent as necessary but incomplete. It would care about context, power, motive, timing, and emotional asymmetry. It would understand that shame can be both abused and deserved. It would acknowledge that loyalty is not primitive, that exclusivity is not always insecurity, that jealousy is not automatically pathology, and that some forms of freedom are too cheap to be worth much. Most of all, it would recognize that handling another person's vulnerability is a moral act, not just a lifestyle preference. That is what the clown cannot do. They cannot discriminate. They can only permit, posture, mock, and rank. And because they cannot discriminate, they cannot build anything deep. They can build scenes, identities, aesthetics, reputations, stories, and temporary arrangements full of verbal sophistication. But depth requires standards that survive mood. It requires reverence for truth over convenience. It requires the ability to say that not everything one can survive is good, not everything one can desire is worthy, and not everything that feels liberating in the moment leaves one more whole. Instead, we get the cathedral of compulsive cool, a place where everyone is trying very hard to seem more unbothered than they are, a place where betrayal is downgraded to a punchline, hurt is recoded as insecurity, shame is treated as heresy, and moral seriousness is mistaken for old furniture. A place full of people who think they are rebelling, when in fact they are just obeying a newer script with the same old vanity at its center. So what is wrong with the sex-positive clown? Not that they enjoy sex, not that they reject old pieties, not that they experiment. What is wrong is that they often mistake appetite for wisdom, detachment for strength, sexual attention for authority, and transgression for depth. They flatten ethics into permissiveness. They trivialize betrayal by ignoring its reality-distorting cruelty. They pathologize pain that may be morally lucid. They weaponize therapeutic language to dodge accountability. They erase power when power complicates desire. They sneer at commitment because commitment imposes limits. They celebrate openness while often serving the interests of the more dominant, the less attached, and the more manipulative. They perform liberation while quietly enforcing a new conformity in which the cardinal sin is admitting that restraint, loyalty, discretion, and self-respect may still matter. That is the rot. The clown will hear all this and laugh because laughter is easier than reflection and easier still than reform. Let them. The old truths will remain after the joke expires. Trust is fragile. Desire is morally dangerous as often as it is delightful. People can agree to what harms them. Some shame is deserved. Some boundaries are wisdom. Some limits protect dignity. Some promises should narrow the self rather than flatter it. And a person who translates every criticism of sexual conduct into an accusation of prudishness is not enlightened. They are just unserious. Unserious about power, unserious about pain, unserious about betrayal, unserious about the human tendency to rationalize whatever flatters appetite, unserious about the difference between being desired and being loved, unserious about the possibility that freedom without character is merely indulgence wearing a halo. It is a small thing to be horny. It is a common thing to seek pleasure. It is even a forgivable thing to be confused. But to take appetite, decorate it with moral buzzwords, weaponize it against dignity, and then parade the result as progress is something else entirely. It is decadence with a smirk. And decadence, however loudly it performs confidence, is still rot.